Good morning and welcome to the Ask Elsa podcast. And I am Elsa Kepi, and you can find out more about me on my website, pleasureforhealth.com. Today, we are going to dive into a topic that many people fear to tread in this area, and that is on the topic of shame. And, how does shame impact our ability to have healthy relationships? How does it affect our ability to have intimacy, to be present to our intimate partners or to people in our lives? And why would we be interested in looking at shame? Most of us want to avoid shame and run as far away as possible. But let's dive a little bit into why it's worth looking at this social emotion of shame and understanding how it works and what we can maybe do to shift some of the shame into a healthier version of either guilt or maybe a healthier version of self-esteem that helps us to process and to feel the shame and let it move through us. So on all these levels, we're going to take a deep dive into the topic of shame. And I was curious about this as being a social emotion because I think a lot of times we look at emotions as being something that we experience by ourselves. But some emotions, envy or jealousy or shame or things like that, are actually social emotions. And that means that, we have these emotions because we're socially engaged with others, or shame, for instance, is that version of seeing ourselves the way other people see us. So it's not just a personal feeling in our own body, it's actually in relation to others. So often it's described as something that we feel when we're aware of having transgressed a norm. And transgressing a norm is an interesting, I thought this was interesting also because a norm has to be something that is desirable and binding, because then we will, feel uncomfortable that we've transgressed it. And so where does this idea of the norm come from? And it turns out that many of us learn this version of shame as a child, particularly as an adolescent. Adolescents are shown in a lot of research to be vulnerable to shame. And so if we were in a family where there were particular norms and we didn't seem to fit into those norms, or we were in a religious group, or we were in a social group, peer group, and we didn't feel that, we adequately fit into that, and we transgress somehow those norms, then the idea of shame or the feeling of shame would come up. So often these norms are formed in childhood, but they affect us all the way into adulthood. And that's, what I find extremely fascinating about this is that, this feeling of shame keeps coming up, and it's a feeling that is easily transferred to many other experiences. It just kind of gets in there and bounces around like a pinball in a pinball machine, hitting all the posts on the way. And so we end up having this feeling of shame that just comes up all the time. We can, if we want to describe it as a sense, it's kind of a sense of smallness, of worthlessness, powerlessness in any given situation. And it's triggered by a perceived break in one's connectedness to others or to oneself. And it can be compounded by a feeling of being exposed, or really concerned about what other people think of us. And it can be kind of real or imagined. There may be actual real disdain or disgust from outside, from others, or we may be imagining that. So, that's a very isolating and self-centering emotion. And so many of you who have listened to my other podcast episodes will know that I am in the business of relationships. And so you can imagine that if you are in shame, and most of us can remember a time of feeling ashamed, we are not very aware of anyone else at that point. We're not aware of what other people are feeling. We're not empathic. We're not able to show up for another, like an intimate partner or a person that we're involved with. And so we just turn inward. So it's this turning inward where, it's the experience of being isolated, and that's the opposite of what we want when we're trying to gain intimacy. So, how do we turn this around and turn it back outward to gain the possibility for having intimacy in a relationship, or the ability to share? And so this is the whole idea of shame, and it can be done. But let's talk a little bit about how shame also can be seen in our nervous system as an attack, as uh, a crisis of some sort. And this crisis can put us into fight or flight. That it's a crisis, a threat to our relational bonds and all of those high value social threads that we have. And so when we are feeling shame, we're activated into a fight or flight response. And typically that will be either a flight, I'm going to go away, I'm going to sink into the floor, I'm going to not engage, or the fight, when someone's ashamed and they lash out in a kind of shame, rage kind of experience. So both of those ways of reacting to shame, you can imagine, are not going to be great for any type of relationship building. If we're either going away or we're fighting, we're not able to be fully present, or in any kind of way. So let's look at a little bit like what we might do in the sense of how might we deal with this, because shame just can get into this negative cycle where it affects, we feel like our core sense of self is worthless, and we are, horrible people, which can kind of lead and be linked well to depression, and get in this negative cycle of focusing on ourselves and depression and victimhood and more shame. And, and then we're ashamed of being ashamed, being, feeling shame. And it just goes around and around, and we get stuck there. And many people that I work with in my relationship programs probably have a big part of their issues as they get stuck in this shame and negative cycle, as opposed to feeling guilty about something we did. You can see from that language that something we did is different. It's we are not bad people, we did something bad to someone maybe, and so it's an action, and we can change that, we can repair that, perhaps we can focus on our relationship to others and make up with them. But the feeling of shame is isolating. So it's these, how do we turn that around? So what's interesting also is to remember that, the feeling of shame you need to feel safe to share. And this is probably the hardest thing about shame, is that once once you're in a shame kind of spiral, it's very difficult to turn that around and actually share with anyone, because you're so ashamed, you're so worried that they will think that you're a horrible person, or that they just look at you the wrong way and you are a horrible person. And so we don't even want to share. And the more secretive we are about our shame, the more that it spirals into a cycle. So the remedy for shame is actually to share about it. And that is something that requires a lot of trust and a lot of safety and a lot of holding space in a non-judgmental way. And, quite often we go to a therapist, or we have a group that we maybe go to. And the benefit of a group or a therapist or a coach or anyone is how well they hold us in non-judgment while we're sharing our shame. We all have shame, and it doesn't take much to actually compound our shame if we go to a therapist and we say, I feel really ashamed about this, and the therapist makes a face or goes, well, I can see why, or something, or even a body gesture that agrees that we should be ashamed of that, and we could actually spin into a worse shame. So it's interesting to notice that, picking a great therapist and finding a non-judgmental place to talk about your shame is vitally important, because this is a social feeling. We need to be seen and heard in a different way, not in a you are a bad kind of person way, but we need to be seen and heard, and it be okay. We're still loved, we're still accepted, we're not cast out. So, it requires this kind of holding space for you. And ideally, this is what would happen in an intimate relationship, is that we would hold each other and be able to share this kind of, feeling with each other and hold space for each other. However, this is not always so easy, especially in an intimate relationship where perhaps we're both feeling triggered or in shame, or, one person actually has some judgment about that, maybe coming from their own shame, and it's really easy to just set each other off. And so having a space in your relationship to voice this, to say, hey, I just need you to listen and not make faces, not agree, not disagree, not try to make me feel better. I just want you to listen for a few minutes, kind of like a personal confessional, perhaps, can help with this. So if you are in a relationship where you're both willing to work with this, I would love to hear how your experience of this might go, where you offer each other a few minutes of your time to listen to something where you felt bad about it. I know for me personally, I've had shame come up around, what seemed to be a small thing. I think I sent an email and I hadn't worded it very well, and somebody kind of called me out on that, and I felt guilty, but I also felt ashamed. Like I should have known better. Like I should have been able to be more, I should have been perfect in the way that I worded it right from the beginning. And why wouldn't I have known that? And so it took about, I would say, a week. And I shared that story with my partner for many times, over and over again, within that week, and just kind of rehashed it, and told the story again. And sometimes I told the story, where the other people were all wrong. And sometimes I told the story where I was doing it all wrong. And sometimes I told the story where we all did things wrong. And sometimes I told the story where I actually saw a couple things I did right. And it kind of went like that until I actually got to a point where I could tell the story without having that somatic, that body feeling of shame, that kind of sinking feeling, or the anger feeling come up. I could just tell it. I can, like I'm telling you now, I wrote this email. I did the best I could at the time. I could have taken more pains to think it over before I sent it. Now I have some better wording for it, and I'm grateful for the experience. But it really took many times sharing that same experience until I worked through the shame. And really that was, a very small thing to start with. So I feel like, when we start looking at big areas of shame in our life where we might be, holding secrets or being really ashamed of something we did, for years or decades even, these are big things. And it's not just about saying it once and having someone hear it. We probably have to say it multiple times. Maybe not always to the same person. Maybe we start sharing, writing in a journal is a great way, because you're actually, even though you're not telling someone else, it's like you're putting it down on paper. It kind of makes it more concrete, like you're sharing with yourself almost. So all of these ways of sharing are important. And it takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of, empathic and ability to hold space for each other. And I see more and more how we are all so stressed and so in our fear response, and so, overtaken by just getting through the day, that we don't actually have time and space to just sit and share. And so one of the best things that we could ever do for our relationships is to make some time, turn the TV off, put your phones away, just, be together, going for a walk or sitting, or, just sharing some quiet moments, like, when you wake up in the morning, and just sharing your feelings and maybe some things you feel ashamed about, quietly, when you ask for support, and just hearing that. So I would love to hear how that goes for you. This, of course, is a huge topic that we could definitely take a lot longer to discuss, but this gives us a little tip of the iceberg to think about. And I hope that it gives you a little sense of how you might take this feeling of shame and transform it, because when we transform shame, we actually can find a pride in ourselves, like kind of self esteem that we've learned something or grown from this experience rather than an isolating, dissociating, dysfunctional way of taking on shame, which ends up making it almost impossible to have relationships at all. So, if you're interested, please do stay in touch. Take a look at my website. I am creating a longer course, an online course on shame, shame and the shadow in our relationships. And if you're interested in that course, keep your eye out, and I will be letting you all know when that is live. But for now, I hope you have a wonderful day and you can find somebody today to share a few minutes with, and maybe to witness them for a few minutes in something where they might feel ashamed, and helping to move that feeling of shame into more social connection. Thanks so much for joining me. Like I said, you can check me out on www.pleasureforhealth.com, and I look forward to sharing with you soon.